Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Your Legislators, a production of KRWG Broadcasting. Your Legislators is a public service production providing our viewing and listening audiences in southern New Mexico the opportunity to hear about important legislative issues directly from their elected representatives in Santa Fe. Now here is your host, Fred Martino.
Thank you so much for joining us for our final edition of Your Legislators for this season. I'm pleased to have with us for the entire program Representative Joseph Cervantes. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's great to be with you and your viewers today.
It's good to have you here, and I want to start off with the positive news. Your thoughts on the most important accomplishments of the 30-day session.
Well, in a 30-day session, we're limited to the budget and to the governor's agenda. And the legislature takes the responsibility for the budget. Our greatest accomplishment was to pass a budget that was approved unanimously by all Democrats and Republicans. That's been difficult the last few years for the legislature to do in a tough economy. We've had to downsize the government considerably, but we've passed balanced budgets every year as we're required to do, and they've been good budgets. The legislature has done a great job in balancing our state budget.
Okay, any particular highlights of the budget that you think are notable?
Well, we've been able to balance the budget with the revenues down significantly and do so without too adversely affecting public education, which is where most of the money goes, without hurting New Mexico State University. We're here today on campus, and a lot of us are very committed to the university, its mission, UNM, and all of our schools around the state. So that's important. We've been able to protect health care through Medicaid and Medicare programs to a large degree. So we've been able to downsize without really hurting people that rely on government day to day.
Okay. As you're aware, one aspect of the budget involves closing some tax loopholes, and there are questions as to whether or not the governor will sign that measure. If she vetoes it, will that mean that the budget will not be in balance any longer?
No, but that's a great example of where the legislature's taken the lead in trying to close a corporate loophole. Right now, big out-of-state corporations like Walmart, as an example, do not pay the same tax rate that New Mexico businesses pay. And so we're trying to level that playing field so that New Mexico businesses are not at a competitive disadvantage. And at the same time, that bill, sponsored by Senator Worth, a Democrat from Santa Fe, would lower the corporate rate on all New Mexico businesses. So the Democrat initiative is to lower the corporate rate on all businesses and do so by raising the tax on out-of-state corporations that are not paying New Mexico taxes. And we're hoping the governor will sign that. She's indicated some hesitation to doing that, protecting the out-of-state, desire to protect the out-of-state businesses over New Mexico businesses.
Okay. Another thing that I know that you consider to be an accomplishment during this session involves the Public Regulation Commission. Let's talk about that.
Well, I'm happy to report that we successfully passed a resolution that will go on the ballot in November, and so New Mexico voters will have the ultimate say. I was pleased to sponsor that in the House and Senate and get that passed yesterday. The voters will have the opportunity to direct the legislature to increase the qualifications on that commission. And that commission is critical to New Mexicans every day. That commission deals with our utility rates, our communications, telephone, electricity, gas. They regulate just about everything that affects New Mexicans day to day. And
it's got a pretty decent paycheck as well, right?
It's a well-paying job. There are 5 commissioners, and because that is such an important position, we as legislators should be looking at the qualifications. Right now, essentially, there are none. You have to be 18 years old and not be a convicted felon, and that's the extent. And so I think that we should be looking closely at maybe having people with greater qualifications serving in that position.
And what are some of the qualifications that would be required if voters approve this?
Well, that'll be ultimately for the legislature to begin the debate next year if the voters approve this, is to authorize the legislature to begin to do that.
Oh, okay.
And we've stayed clear of trying to really discuss what those qualifications should be or not be right now. The key right now is just to undertake the task and recognize the need to establish those qualifications. This is the first step to do that.
And putting it in the voters' hands.
That's right. Exactly.
Okay. Well, some major things that we really should discuss in terms of the session that were not passed. The legislature as you know, failed to require disclosure for political spending. What happened with that?
Well, we're concerned about what we're seeing in this presidential race right now. You see that at the national level with the Republican primaries, where you have huge corporations spending tens of millions of dollars. And the problem is that with the recent Supreme Court case in the United New Mexico decision, I'm sorry, the Supreme Court Citizens United, thank you, decision, the difficulty is that information now can remain confidential. And so the difficulty that we have in New Mexico is we're concerned about out-of-state big interests coming in with large sums of money and putting them into campaigns and doing so in the dark of the night. So we have attempted the last 2 sessions to pass some reform that would require the disclosure. The difficulty is in a 30-day session, it's tough to get very complicated legislation passed.
So you ran out of time, that's bottom line.
That really is what happened on that piece of legislation. There was a lot of good effort and a lot of good work. I've sponsored that legislation in years past, and we're getting closer, but we're not quite there.
Okay. As you know as well, some concern about another bill that failed, and that was to give legal immunity to companies involved with spaceport flights. Some say that this will really hurt the spaceport. Your thoughts?
Well, I appreciate the many calls and letters I got from here in Las Cruces and back here at home that are concerned with this issue. And the goal, I think, of some was to try and immunize Virgin Galactic or those that are doing the space tourism from any sort of liability to their passengers. I think the concern here is what that immunity would do in terms of safety to the public at large and to those passengers. And it's a balance. You know, there's something to be said of the economic development potential for something like spaceport. On the other hand, we don't immunize auto manufacturers who are a huge part of our economy, but we want them to be putting safe products on the road.
Yeah, and now as I understand it, this bill would have provided immunity for damage to the passengers. Did it go beyond that, though?
Well, I never saw that bill coming over to our committee, so I didn't have a lot of time to spend on that immunity. It never made it out of the preliminary committees, and I serve on the Judiciary Committee, which is usually the last committee of any before it gets final passage. Okay. So I never heard the full debate and discussion on the bill, but my understanding is that it would have prevented passengers from suing the manufacturers of the equipment, the rocketry, and so forth, if there was a loss or damage to that person. And that has some potential risk. We have seen some rare but unfortunate incidents in space where lives have been lost.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll hear about that bill again in a future session. Another one we may hear about again involves the education bill that failed that would have held back students who can't read proficiently. Your thoughts on that?
Well, we came very close to passing legislation that would begin to address the fact that we're passing on too many students who can't read. My wife teaches here at the university, has taught in the past, and we see too oftentimes students that are reaching even the university level who lack the reading skills that we'd like to see. So there's a need here to be addressing that. The key is to make sure that there are the resources available to the schools that are being asked to hold back these students, more classrooms, more teachers, and the programs to assure the success of any student who is held back so that they're not just lost into the system. There's a lot of concern about the fact that students who are held back oftentimes tend to have a greater incidence of dropout rates later on. So we're trying to balance, again, some complicated issues, the need to make sure that students can read before they're passed on, and at the same time, if we hold them back, making sure that they are then put in a position to succeed down the road.
Yeah, sometimes things sound simple, but they're more complicated than they sound at first. And this is an example of that, a lot of people say.
Absolutely. If the public sometimes sees issues to be simple, I hope they'll always dig into the arguments that work both sides, because you're absolutely right. They oftentimes are much more complicated than they seem.
Senator Morales, who was on the program last week, he has, as you know, a PhD in education, and so we talked a lot about education. One other thing that he talked about involved something that the legislature approved in the last session, to have A through F grades for schools. And this again was one where he says, and has been speaking out on this, not just with us but with others, that this sounded very simple, and it sounded like it would bring a lot of clarity to how is my school doing, But he says that this turned out to not in practice be as simple as it sounds, and that the formula even for creating these grades, there's a lot of questions surrounding it. How is it developed? And schools seem to be having, according to him, some question about how the formula is developed. So what are your thoughts on that, and how we move forward on education reform? Because this is one where I imagine just about every piece of legislation that comes before you may be much more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Well, it's a great place for us to be focused, though. I mean, 2/3 of our state budget goes into public education, either at grade school level or university levels. Mm-hmm. So given that commitment of our state taxpayers, we need to be focusing there. I agree with what you've been told by Senator Morales. It's very simplistic, speaking as a father of 3 children who are now in public schools here in Las Cruces. It's pretty simplistic to think that we're going to make a lot of progress in changing and reforming public education by giving schools grades A through F. It's somewhat gimmicky to me, but it's a step, and it's one step of many that need to be taken.
One of the things in regard to that particular piece of legislation, and just about anything that is related to education reform that often is left out of the discussion, is looking at statistics. This is not just about teachers and schools. This is also very closely tied to socioeconomics. That average test scores are very much tied to the socioeconomic conditions. And a lot of critics say public policy should be focusing on those conditions of poverty in addition to looking at the schools and the teachers. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I like the fact that you said in addition, because we have to accept the fact that two go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. We're going to bring businesses to New Mexico, and they're going to grow in New Mexico when we can show them a well-educated workforce, and when we can move off the bottom of national statistics in education. Conversely, on the other hand, when we bring in those good businesses, we're going to raise our wages in the community, and we're going to then be able to do a better job of educating our children. So they work hand in hand. We've got to do both. We've got to be educating our children better today with the idea of attracting businesses and improving socioeconomics in our community down the road.
Okay. Moving on to another issue, and this one really, talk about controversy, deals with a bill. This was the second time that this came up that would have allowed state and local governments to restrict fireworks in extreme drought. And we had this horrible wildfire season, millions and millions of dollars in public property, private property, the cost to fight the fires, and yet this bill did not pass. What happened?
Well, again, I'm at somewhat of a disadvantage because I didn't get a chance to hear that bill in any of the committees that I serve on. It was tabled really very early in the session. I think a big part of that is, again, that we're dealing with a 30-day session, and there's a limited amount of time to do certain work outside of the budget. The other issue, I think, is the question that inevitably comes up is, you're right, we've had huge and horrible forest fires around the state of New Mexico, but they're not fires that are started by fireworks typically. They're fires that are started from any number of different causes. Mm-hmm. And so it seems, once again, overly simplistic to pass laws against fireworks when the problems may be caused and started by something completely unrelated to fireworks.
Senator Morales mentioned that this was one of the arguments used in terms of debate against this particular piece of legislation. What do you say to folks, though, who say, even though some of the fires may have not been caused by the fireworks, that, of course, potentially this is a danger, and we even do things like prevent people from having campfires, so why wouldn't we allow local governments and the state in an extreme drought situation to say, you can't use fireworks?
Right. Well, let me be clear. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't give that authority to local governments. And having served on the county commission here in Doña Ana County, I think that may be a good idea. Mm-hmm. The conditions that may apply in Ruidoso, for example, may not be the same conditions that apply here in Las Cruces in a given year. And so I think it is important for local governments to have that kind of control, to look at drought conditions, to look at fire dangers, and then for the local community to weigh in on those issues.
Hopefully this won't happen, but I mean, if we do have this continued drought and we have a fire that is caused by fireworks, it's determined fireworks caused it, Are you concerned about how that will look for the legislature not to have gotten this through, since it was the second time?
I have no doubt that if we had a fireworks of fire, that there would be criticism, I think, of the fact that that bill and that local ordinance was not passed.
Okay. Another one that is certainly getting a lot of attention. In fact, there was an article recently in the newspaper from one of the people who is involved in development of policy at the Educational Retirement Board, is the failure for passing pension reform. I understand there were bills out there both for the ERB and the PERA, reforming both of those systems in order to ensure long-term solvency. Your thoughts on why these didn't go through?
Well, first of all, we should be clear that the people that have those concerns are right on point. We have two funds for public employees at large, and then funds for retired educators. And people have worked their lifetime to accumulate and rely upon those retirement benefits, but those funds are increasingly at risk because the demands of people pulling on those funds and those retirement benefits are not keeping pace with what is being paid into those funds. And then, frankly, the biggest problem we've had has been the downturn in the economy, where the market return on those funds has been down. So as many of our viewers may have stock market investments or other retirements invested in certain funds, as the performance and the return on those funds has gone down, likewise the state return has come down. So we're going to have to be looking at ways to shore up those funds and do so soon. It's much more prudent to do so now and do so gradually, rather than wait until we're at a crisis stage and then have to do so in a big way.
Is there anything you can pin down to say caused these pieces of legislation to fail this time?
Well, there are a number of factors. One is that, of course, it's difficult to go back to public employees and educators and ask them to contribute even more to these funds than they're already doing, because over the last few years we haven't given them raises. We haven't been able as a state to budget for them to keep pace with the economy and the other demands. So we've already been pushing public employees and educators about as hard as anybody could be pushed in this state to deal with this economic climate. So to ask them for more is difficult. And then, of course, Governor Martinez has indicated that she's not willing to look at any other ways to raise revenues from alternative sources. And so if we don't have additional funds coming into those programs, the options are very limited, and that's part of why you're seeing difficulty passing a solution. The only other alternative is to reduce those benefits, or increase the age of retirement, for example, or require more years of service, and all of those are on the table.
Okay. Probably one of the most reported on issues that came up again and again, there was no action on it, involved ending driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. Your thoughts on this?
Well, that bill has been a challenge the last couple of years because there are good arguments on both sides, and frankly, there's not a good solution. We're choosing between two bad solutions. If we make sure that we stop issuing driver's licenses to people in the country illegally, then the presumption is that all of those people will stay in the country and will continue to drive, and we'll simply have people driving who don't have licenses, who haven't gone through the education, the training, and lack the insurance to be on the roads. When we first passed this, we had law enforcement solidly in support of issuing driver's licenses for purposes of identification. So there are good reasons to have the policy at the time that it was adopted, but there are now good reasons to look the other way. Most states have abandoned this approach, and I think it's wrong for states to be trying to unilaterally adopt immigration policy. So just as I think it's wrong for Arizona to be trying to come up with its own immigration laws, or the city of Santa Fe to have its own immigration laws, it's not wise for New Mexico to be trying to adopt its own immigration laws. This is a failure at the federal level, and we need to be putting pressure on the federal government to get to the bottom of this problem.
Do you think that's happening?
No, it's not. There's been, unfortunately, very little effort at the federal level to make some progress here. And that's the argument that I make, is that if we took all of the energy that goes into this public debate here in New Mexico, starting from the governor to the rallies to the advocates on both sides, if we took all of that public energy and effort and put it into a constructive dialogue at the federal level, I think we'd make a lot more progress than using it as a political wedge issue in campaigns here in New Mexico.
Okay, very interesting. Speaking of the governor, the legislature failed to confirm her education secretary designate, Hannah Skandera, for the second time. Your thoughts on that?
Well, confirmations are done over in the Senate, and I leave it to the Senate to handle their business without being too critical of their work. I think it's important to point out that the Senate has confirmed most of the cabinet secretaries of Governor Martinez, that she hasn't withdrawn. She's presented some people initially and then right away turned back those names from the Senate. We had that issue with the state fair during this last session as well. She had nominated some people. The Senate was moving ahead to confirm her own nominees, and then she decided she didn't want to have those people nominated. So, I think the Senate's been fair to the governor's nominees. We still have the cabinet secretary on education, and I think the issue or concern there has been the fact that she may not meet the constitutional requirements for that position. The Constitution requires an educator to serve as the cabinet secretary of education, and she's not an educator.
It sounds like you are endorsing the traditional view that why have a confirmation process if there isn't some due diligence involved? I mean, I've heard other people argue, let the governor pick her team, and so almost sounding as if the confirmation process really is just a formality, but it sounds like you're endorsing the traditional view here.
Well, what I'm endorsing is the legislature takes an oath to affirm the Constitution and uphold the Constitution.
Right.
If the Constitution says a cabinet secretary has to have certain qualifications, the legislature has a constitutional duty to make sure they meet those minimum qualifications. Otherwise, I agree, the governor should have the opportunity to have her own team, but that team has to comply with the law. And if the nominee doesn't comply with the law, the legislature has an oath to affirm that law, including the Constitution.
Where do you think this leaves this situation?
Well, I think the governor's made clear that she's going to keep her cabinet secretary designee in office without Senate confirmation, and I believe that she's lawfully probably entitled to do that. So I think we'll just stay in limbo, and that's certainly, I think, the governor's prerogative to do that.
Okay. What other issues for you really stood out during this particular session that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet? We only have a couple of minutes left.
Well, a 30-day session goes by really quickly. 4 weeks may not seem like a long time when you're there and trying to get bills passed in the House and through the Senate and go through the committee process. So for a successful 30-day session, you have to be organized. You have to have your ducks in a row starting out ahead of time. In this session, we just didn't have that. This is the governor's session. The governor sets the agenda in a 30-day session, and frankly, the session just wasn't well organized in advance. So for example, the governor issued 44 executive messages in the first 2 weeks, and then in those same 2 weeks took back 34 of the 44 messages she issued for new legislation to come in. So we have to do a much better job in a 30-day session of assuring what the governor wants to do ahead of time and making sure they know what they're going to do ahead of time, rather than trying to decide halfway through the session what topics may be relevant to the legislature.
Is there actually legislation needed to try to reform this process, or
well,
is it more just the management of it?
Well, there's certainly the need for a dialogue. In fact, for years I've passed or tried to pass a look at our entire state constitution. You know, we're 100 years old and we're still doing things with this 30-day and 60-day session where we limit ourselves. And it may be overdue for an overhaul. And so I've been trying for the last years to look at our state constitution from front to back and look at the entire way we do business in the state of New Mexico. And I think that's needed. But for now, when we have the current functioning constitution, in a 30-day session like we just had, it's the governor's session, and she controls the agenda other than the budget. The legislature controls the budget only. And so when we have a short session and the governor's in control, we need some pretty strong leadership from the person setting that agenda.
When you say the possibility of changing the way the legislature does business, would one possibility be some kind of opportunity for voters to endorse the idea of a full-time legislature?
Well, that's a dialogue we need to be having. I mean, New Mexico is really the last state in the country that still has what we call a citizens legislature. We all have jobs. We don't get paid for our service. We come in as volunteers trying to do service to the state. Times have changed in the last 100 years. Most states have professional legislatures with offices. We have no offices. We have no staff during the year. And so constituent needs and so forth sometimes go unmet. So I think we should be looking at modernizing the way we do our state government, and that's going to take looking at the entire way that our citizen legislature is organized.
In addition to affecting the way that the legislature operates, of course, having the current system in place where it is not a full-time legislature, critics say that that limits who can be a legislator, because certainly a lot of folks are unable with their job responsibilities to be able to leave for a certain period of time, leave their jobs. Your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a good point. I think we have probably a much larger number of people in the legislature who are retirees, for example, because those are people who don't have to leave a job to go up and serve. And I'm fortunate that I have a profession and we have businesses that allow me that opportunity to be away for a couple of months out of the year. But many people don't have those opportunities, and so it does limit the people who can serve. At the same time, I think our legislature's enriched by the fact that we have people who, like me, have businesses, who are in the community, who are working and have professions and careers and are not really full-time politicians. And we have a doctor here from Las Cruces who serves. We have a number of business people that are serving in the legislature, and that's a good thing to have those voices heard as well too. So it's a balance, and we ought to be talking more about how to find the right place for that balance.
Well, in addition to serving in the legislature, we appreciate the fact that you take time out to inform the larger public about what's going on in the legislature with us here at KRWG.
You all have been great now and in the past, and it's good to have this opportunity to talk in a little more detail than the television sound bites that we
15 seconds won't do it.
Right, the newspaper and TV sound bites don't work. This is a great forum.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Your Legislators is a production of KRWG Broadcasting. Copyright New Mexico State University Board of Regents.